case when we were due to leave New York, and there was a heck of a thunderstorm going on. It was chucking it down with rain, and this guy was kicking off and saying, I'm never going to fly Laker Airways again, and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't me who was dealing with it, it was one of my colleagues. And she said to him, well, she said, that's your choice, sir, but please just take a look out of the window. And if you look behind you, you will see the British Airways. Because he said, oh, I'm going to fly British Airways, da, 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 da. She said, you'll see the British Airways plane. They're about 10 planes behind us in this queue. And if you look ahead of us, you will see there's another 15 or 20 planes. So this is nothing to do with Laker Airways. This is to do with the weather we're experiencing at New York Airport. So, yeah, and you always had to be like that.
Rachel, at what stage in your life did you find yourself? What relationship broke you to help you discover yourself?
Oh, gosh, that's a big question. Yeah. I mean, I guess it starts right from childhood, doesn't it? Those early relationships, we're always learning about ourselves. You know, I was the third of three children. So my brother is 8.5 years older than me. My sister is 2.5. So she and I were very close, whereas my brother, you know, was a little bit out of the loop in a sense, because I mean he left home when he was 15 to go and work on a farm, so I was only 7 or 8 myself at that time. So like we all do, I think, if we have siblings, we learn about you know, sharing and things not being fair, which is always a big thing for kids, isn't it? Oh, life's not fair and all of that sort of thing. So I guess that was probably the first relationship where I learned about that. And then you know, different friendships throughout school. I always I didn't ever feel short of friends, both in junior school and secondary. I grew up in a small country town in Dorset called Sherborne, population of about 8,000 people. So there were 2 state primary schools. And I went to a grammar school with about less than 200 girls across the 7 years of education. So fairly small schools, always one class entry. And yeah, I can't think of any specific instance right now, but I definitely, you learn a lot through those friendships, through the falling outs, through the making ups and remaking those friendships, and also by watching the friendships around you, and and by experimenting and sometimes getting things horribly wrong. You know, some things that now I'd like to think I wouldn't do in the same way. Do you want me to give you an example of that?
Of course, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I can remember when we were probably about 14 or 15, there was an incident at school where the sixth form were the girls that were doing their art A levels were preparing all their work to be submitted for the A level exam. And there was one particular painting that a friend of mine absolutely loved. For some reason or other, we'd all seen the artwork. I guess there might have been a bit of display, and she'd absolutely loved it. And she kept on about this piece of artwork. And then a couple of days later, an announcement was made in the, we used to have a daily assembly, that this piece of artwork had gone missing from the art room, that somebody had taken it. And all the request was to have it put back. They didn't necessarily need to know who had taken it, although they would like the person to own up. And of course, if anybody knew anything about it. And I didn't quite know what to do, because I didn't know, I had no idea that whether my friend had taken this piece or not. But she was a little bit of a rebel. And certainly I know I had been out with her around the shops where she had taken things from shops. I always remember once we were in a music shop and I used to play music, and we got outside and she handed me this music book that she'd taken and smuggled up her jumper. And it's like, I don't want it, it's stolen. But there was nothing we could do at that point. But so I decided that I needed to go to the headmistress to tell her that this friend had loved the photo and I had loved the painting. And I said, I have no idea whether she'd taken it or not, but I just felt the head teacher needed to know that. And I never to this day knew whether she did or didn't, but of course she was duly summoned to the headmistress, and she came out in such floods of tears and so upset with me for having gone to the headmistress, that in that moment I thought maybe I needed a bit more information to have gone to the head. So yeah, sometimes with that sort of trying to do the right thing, you actually very much do the wrong thing. I can't even remember whether the photo was ever retrieved or not, but yeah, so just it's learning, isn't it? And I always remember when my own kids were young, one of the other mums always used to say when the kids were getting it wrong, she said, they're all still learning, aren't they?
True.
Yeah.
So apart from having an older brother and sister, what was your relationship like with your parents?
My mum very much ruled the roost. My dad did what he was told pretty much, except he didn't really. He just, so if she was ever not around, we as kids knew we could get away with anything. So even in our teenage times, if mum, my sister and I used to smoke when we were out of the house. Both parents were smokers at that time, but they didn't want us to be. And if my mum caught us, there would be hell to pay. But if my dad caught us, it would be don't tell your mother kind of thing.
Right.
So, yeah. So my mum was very much in charge of the household. Yeah.
And being the youngest child, did you find that you could pick up, life lessons from your brother and sister?
Yes, so we all had very different paths, to be honest. As I say, my brother in a way was out of the picture because he'd left home at 15 when I was still very young. He was doing his own thing of following a farming career at that time. My sister was very much my dad's favorite, I think. So in a way, her life was very different to mine. I was sporty. She wasn't particularly. So in terms of relationships, I suppose there was a little bit of jealousy about the relationship she had with my dad. I mean, my dad always did everything a good parent should do for me. But I just always had this sense that, I wasn't ever quite good enough for him in myself. Not that what I did wasn't good enough, but that I never quite made the mark for him. So, and I think that probably has stayed with me even right now, I think.
Yeah. And did you complete sixth form and go on to university after school?
I did complete sixth form. I didn't get the grades I needed at that stage to go to uni. So what happened was I left and went to work in London. I knew I wanted to go to London. I started a job in the Home Office, absolutely hated it, and thought, well, the only route out of this is to get a degree. So eventually I did go to uni when I was 21. Yeah.
What did you learn about university and the broader life,
I studied
as a mature student?
Yeah, I wouldn't class myself as a mature student. I think at that time, mature students were deemed to be sort of 24 plus. I certainly hung out with the 18 and 19-year-olds rather than the 25 plus, because as I say, I was 21. But still quite naive about life in London, I think. Whereas my two best friends, who are still very good friends, had grown up in London. So in terms of street cred, if you like, they were further forward than I was. So I learned a lot from them, from those relationships, and continue to do so. And following uni, I went then to Brighton University. My goal had been to be an educational psychologist, not fully understanding what that role actually involves, but that was my goal. And I got offered at the last minute a place on a master's course in psychology at the University of Sussex. Went to take that up only to find that it was actually, I forget the name of the type of psychology, but it wasn't the workings of the human brain or human beings. It was why, do you see the same shade of red or blue as I see? And why, all that kind of thing. And you needed really a physics background, and I dropped science at the age of 15, so I left that course halfway through. A couple of little part-time jobs to keep me going. Then eventually I went to work for Laker Airways. Some of your listeners may never have heard of Laker Airways because it's not around now, but I was cabin crew for 3 years. So yeah.
And what did you learn from life, from that experience working with Laker Airways?
Learned a lot about life, because obviously you encounter on an airline, you encounter a lot of different people. One of the things that I learned, I think, was if certain people, when in their normal lives, so maybe in their jobs, their families or whatever, if they are used to being in a position of control, seniority, whatever you want to call it, when they are not, they sometimes don't behave well. So, for example, there'll be certain, in my view, this is only my humble opinion and my observation, that the types of passenger that would kick off when we were delayed, when things weren't going to plan for whatever reason, would typically be those people that I suspect were used to being able to say to somebody, get this sorted. And here they were on an aircraft where not even the captain of the plane could get it sorted. So that was one of my observations about people. And that whole thing around the safety, which of course is the prime reason for cabin crew being there, that most people will do as they're asked if they understand. Again, you're always going to have a few that are going to kick the tires, as it were. So yeah, lots of learning about people just on a day-to-day basis, really.
Yeah, I can imagine being cabin crew, you have to be able to deal with people as they come.
Yes.
People are going to be cooperative in the main, but you'll always find that people are the odd person here and there on the plane can be difficult because they've had too much to drink in the bar, or they, as you say, they have to be in control of the situation and they feel they have to order the pilot, the cabin crew around the place because they want a smooth journey from A to B. Even if they're a minute late leaving, it's like the world has kind of come to an end as such for them as such. They just have to be bang on time and in control of every situation.
Yes, there was one classic case when we were due to leave New York and there was a heck of a thunderstorm going on. It was chucking it down with rain. And this guy was kicking off and saying, I'm never going to fly Laker Airways again, and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't me who was dealing with it, it was one of my colleagues. And she said to him, well, she said, that's your choice, sir, but please just take a look out of the window. And if you look behind you, you will see the British Airways. Because he said, oh, I'm going to fly British Airways, da, 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 da. She said, you'll see the British Airways plane. They're about 10 planes behind us in this queue. And if you look ahead of us, you will see there's another 15 or 20 planes. So this is nothing to do with Laker Airways. This is to do with the weather we're experiencing at New York Airport. So, yeah, and you always had to be like that. And of course, there was also, this didn't happen very often, but people had a view about how they could treat people in hospitality roles, frankly. And I'm going to say particularly women. I think we did have some male cabin crew, but not many. But I think there were certain people that felt it was okay to be rude, to, I guess now we might call it out. I don't know that I don't recall anybody being actually either physically or emotionally abusive, but just feeling they had the right to speak to you as they wanted to speak to you.
Yeah.
And just always having to not accept it, but not rebuff.
What did you do with your life after exiting Laker Airways?
So then, complete change. I went to work for the London Borough of Sutton, and they were running this, what was at the time a very innovative project for juvenile offenders. So young people aged 10 to 17 who were finding themselves coming up to be sentenced in court for an offence for which they were highly likely to receive a custodial sentence. And that might be because of the severity of the offence itself, but it was more likely to be because they'd done it so many times before that the courts had tried everything else that was available to them. So, excuse me, we were coming in saying, we know you're thinking of sending this person to, in those days, it was a detention centre or Borstal, was the terminology here. It's now young people's prisons, I believe. But please don't, because we're going to have him on this project and we're going to work on with him on his offending behaviour, da 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 da. The theory behind that was that we only ever had one girl on that project. She was in the Old Bailey for arson, so actually the judge did not send her on our project. Everybody else we dealt with were boys. And it was about managing them through the maturation process, because the vast majority of kids offending were stealing cars, some burglary, and that kind of stuff. By the time they were 17, if they had not gone into custody, it was more than likely that they would have left school and got a job, possibly got a girlfriend, and straightened themselves out. There was many studies to show that if in that process they were sent to a custodial institution, that it was much more likely that in order to survive in there, they would get caught up with the wrong crowd, as it were, and were much more likely to continue their offending path. So that was the thing behind. So again, lots of learning about young people who perhaps didn't have a similar career path to most of the people that I'd grown up with. And, you know, lots of learning about all sorts of things, really.
And post working with the London Borough of Sutton, what did you do it yourself for professionally?
Then I went from there. I went to the London Borough of Southwark, which is one of the busiest inner London boroughs in terms of childcare, child abuse, and so on. For a period of time, I was what they called their juvenile court officer. So I sat in court and was the liaison between the court and the social services department. And on the back of that job, I then moved into the legal department. And my job was to prepare the legal proceedings for care proceedings. So everybody else in the team was a qualified lawyer, but because Southwark had a very rigorous equal opportunities policy, they couldn't say you had to be a lawyer if you didn't need to be. And actually all they needed you to have was a up-to-date working knowledge of the relevant law around care proceedings. And because of the previous job that I'd had, I had that, so I got the job. And it was curious because none of my colleagues enjoyed going to court to do the advocacy, whereas I loved it. And so on a Friday morning, I would go down to court with a pile of files this high, and I would do all the advocacy on everybody's cases, and then they would help me out with some of my stuff in return. So that was kind of one of my introductions to speaking in public, basically. And it was where I observed, John, that in many of the cases where there wasn't a clear outcome, that very often the case that won was the case where the advocate was the most articulate. And that was my observation, and I realized that was grossly unfair, but it was just a fact of life. I was also at the same time running training courses for social workers on how to appear in court. And back in those days, social workers would typically go into work wearing jeans, bell bottoms, t-shirts, not necessarily smart. And their argument was, why should it matter what they wear to court? It shouldn't make any difference to what they have to say. And whilst they were absolutely right, it should not. The fact is that we all form an impression of people based on how they appear. And they weren't there for their own representation. They were there to represent their clients. And it does, and the basic fact is that it does make a difference how you appear in court. So those were kind of two of my big learnings at that stage, I think, in terms of relationships and people and so on.
It's an interesting observation. And I think what you're saying there, Rachel, is that if you turn up in court, you're polished in your appearance, you're well dressed, shoes polished, well groomed. That tells the judge that you're taking the situation seriously. Whereas if you turn up underprepared, you're setting a poor image of yourself with the defense counsel, with the prosecution counsel, and with the judge, and you're doing yourself no service at all.
Yes, and it's more about the service to your client, John.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, I get it. They're right. It shouldn't make a difference, but the bottom line is that it does. And it, you know, I don't know that they needed to be in a very smart suit with shiny shoes, but they needed to be neat and you know, dressed appropriately for that scenario.
And from there, did you go into your professional speaking and career coaching and speaking?
No. So by this time I've started doing training. So that was, you know, another pathway towards it. But at that point, I then went, so my partner at the time was offered a job in Thailand. He was in construction and we went to Thailand. We went ostensibly for 2 years. And stayed there for 9 in the end. So at that point, I had got a place. I was so enjoying the advocacy that I'd got a place on a course where I was going to be able to convert the degree I had so that I could become a barrister. So it was quite a big decision for me as to whether to go with him to Thailand or not. But at that point, I thought, well, I've always wanted to go and live and work overseas, but with the work that I was doing, I couldn't see how that was going to happen. So here was my opportunity to do that. And because we were going for 2 years, I thought, well, I can, if I really want to do the barrister route, I can do that when we get back. But as I say, we ended up coming back 9 years later with 2 young children in tow. And by that time, you know, the idea of becoming a barrister was gone. What I did while I was there, I did a job for the first year in a law firm as their English editor, which was fine, but it wasn't taking me anywhere for my own career progression because we don't need English editors in England or Ireland or wherever. So I then had a job with the British Embassy, but at the same time there was a organisation that offered counselling to people who spoke English well enough to access the counselling. So mostly expats, but a few Thai nationals as well. And I asked them if they would take me on as a trainee, because when I was working with the juvenile offenders, I'd done a very basic counselling course, because whenever you're working with kids, you are, however informally, doing a little bit of counselling. And luckily for me, they took me on. So at the same time, I did a distance learning course, which I know is not ideal for counselling, but I was very closely supervised by very, very experienced and qualified American counsellors. And so I did that. So that was a huge learning curve about people and relationships with the clients that I had. So yeah, there was, you know, a few things sort of stood out for me over that. And then when we came back in the year 2000, by this time my children were 6 and 3, I thought I would become an independent counsellor, but of course that meant having my own business, John, and having worked for local authorities where business is almost a dirty word, I had no idea how to set up in a business. So that didn't particularly work out. So I then became a counsellor with a weight loss program for people who were clinically obese, and they were looking for people with counselling backgrounds and so on to do this work, because part of the program was a cognitive behavioural counselling program. And so this was all about relationships with food, which was fascinating in a way, because I'd gone into that role because it worked around the family. Neither weight loss nor addiction, which is what we were dealing with, were specialties or special interests of mine, but I did find it quite fascinating. I mean, I think I can eat for England, but one of the directors said to me, she said, I think you'll get on better in this role, Rachel, if you stop trying to identify with the behavior of some of your clients and you know, thinking you understand their eating behavior, because clearly you don't, because of, you know, the size I am now and pretty much have always been. And that was some very wise advice for me that I've kind of taken forward, because, you know, some of the things that I heard people say around eating behaviors just were complete eye-openers for me. And yeah, the whole thing about relationships with food. We might all say, oh yeah, we'll have a bit of chocolate or an extra glass of wine or whatever it is when we're feeling a bit low, but it went so much deeper than that for people who maybe were carrying an additional 6 to 8 stone of weight and had done for much of their adult life. There was often a lot more beneath the surface on that. So that was interesting learning for me.
You've had a very varied and different professional life, I would say, to be honest, Rachel. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a very eclectic background, I think, John. Yeah. Yeah.
So, in terms of personal relationships or looking for a man in your life, were you the person who'd be first up on the dance floor at a disco, or would you be the person who'd be like myself, hanging onto the bar?
I think in my younger years, I wouldn't have been so quickly up, but now I would be one of the first up. Interestingly, my children's dad, who I was married to and with for 25 years, the complete opposite. He would come onto the dance floor occasionally, but not for very long. So yeah, I would be one of the first up, and once I'm up, I'm there till the end of the party, basically. I like to dance, I like to have a nice time. Yeah.
Fair play to you. Yeah. A couple of questions here for you, Rachel. And the first one is, looking back at your past, what circumstances would you consider as character building blocks that shape the person you've become today?
Wow. I guess the full answer to that, John, must be that every single thing leads us to where we are, doesn't it? But there would be some specific things, I suppose. I think some pieces of advice that I've had have helped me. One was I mentioned I didn't get the grades I needed to take up my university place at the age of 18, and at the time I had a part-time job in a pub, small town, knew most of the people that came in regularly, and was sitting one day chatting to this chap who was one of my parents' friends, and he said, well, why don't you phone them up and say, you haven't got the grades you wanted, but would they consider taking you anyway? And this was like, oh, how could I possibly do that? You don't phone up universities. Because my parents were both left school at 13, so this whole thing of school exams and going to university was kind of, they were fish out of water with it, really. So they would be the kind of people that you don't argue with the doctor, that kind of thing. So for them, phoning university would certainly not be something they would encourage me to do or even think to do. And he said, well, what have you got to lose? He says, right now they're saying, no, you can't have your place. He says, the worst thing that they're going to turn around and say to you if you phone them up is, no, you haven't got your place. And he said, there's just whereas they might think, oh, that shows a bit of spirit in this girl, we'll take her. Now, I just didn't have the confidence at that time, so I didn't make that phone call. But that piece of advice has always stayed with me, and more latterly, I will have acted on something like that. That whole thing of, well, what's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to say no, so I'll ask. And very often that stands me in very good stead, because just the fact that you ask, some people will say yes. And I'm always prepared for a no. So yeah, I think it's things like that I was in a very down situation at that time, and who knows what would have happened if I'd made that phone call. It doesn't bear dwelling on now anyway, but it was good advice that I have always held on to.
Yeah,
I think too, traveling, I traveled quite a bit. I went, so when I was about 22, the first long holiday when I was at uni, a friend and I went to Israel for 6 weeks. And for 4 weeks of that, we were on a kibbutz where we were fairly well looked after. But then we had 2 weeks traveling. So, all of that traveling, going places, particularly if I went by myself. When we were in Thailand, I quite often, my partner had to work at weekends because he was in construction, so I would quite often take off somewhere new and go exploring by myself. And that, I think, was all very character building, because you learn a lot about people and how they are. Even though you might not share a language, you can share a spirit, you can share a smile, you can share an intention. And I think that helped me, it helped me a lot in where I am now, I think.
You said that your parents left school early. Were you the type of parent yourself who was determined to get a good education for your children, or were you happier for your kids to develop the all-important life skills rather than just focusing on academic results alone?
Yeah, well, like all parents, I wanted the best for them, or I want the best for them. I have two very different children. My daughter is my older child, and she has done very well through the education system, whereas my son has additional needs. So their paths were always going to be very different. But it was always, my main goal was that they would be very rounded people. But I was also very keen that they would go as far as they were able to. So I know that, when my daughter was in her teens, I remember particularly she wanted to give up French ahead of doing GCSEs. But at that time, apparently the good universities were only taking kids that had a GCSE in a modern language. And she was doing fine at it. There's no reason for her to give it up. And my argument would always be, education and exams just open doors. They don't mean life is over if you don't get the grades you need. And I do firmly believe that I know there are many people out there who, for whatever reason, barely have an exam result to their name, and they've been very successful. So it just carves a different pathway for them. But having those results and certificates, as I say, I think it just keeps doors open as they go up through that educational system. So it was always finding the balance, but I would never have wanted them to focus solely on their education. It was important for me that they were decent human beings as well. Whereas it was important to me that they treated other people well. But I took great care never to say this thing that a lot of parents say, don't forget your manners. Because I don't know about you, John, but I've encountered so many people in life who have learnt a set of manners that they might display, but somehow that is totally out of alignment with the behaviour that's going on. And I wanted my children to have it from within, that they respected and treated people well, not that they were trying to set and follow a set of rules that was laid down for them. So, for example, if they went to tea at a friend's house, rather than saying, oh, don't forget your manners, remember to thank so-and-so's mum, I would say, now, Joe, when you come away from so-and-so's house, how do you think it might make the mum feel if you just come away without saying anything? And how do you think it might make her feel if you say thank you very much for a lovely tea? So I would try and encourage them to really think about what it felt like to be thanked and whatever, and for them to want to do it for that reason, not because they've been told they must. So
that's an interesting approach, and I agree with that, because I think where parents have too many rules in the house, kids will follow those rules or they're living under your roof. Then when they go out and get their independence, they'll start doing the exact opposite. Whereas if you encourage people to start thinking for themselves and how their actions impact other people from a young age, particularly at the teenage age, then they'll see the bigger picture and be more considerate of people in the longer term. So I think you're quite right there.
Yes.
And one final question here for you, Rachel. Uh, Name one relationship you'd like to have again, given another chance. And what would you do differently this time around?
Golly, that's a really tough one, John. I'm struggling with an answer for that. There are relationships that have sort of drifted away or come to an end. Yeah, I'm honestly, I'm sorry, I'm really struggling to answer that one. For sure, it's always that thing, isn't it? You look back at relationships, and now if the same thing was to happen, I would definitely deal with it very differently. I'm going to say I'm not going to pick a specific one, but there was a couple of relationships with different guys along the route that didn't end well for me. I'm going to say I in my perception would be that they had really treated me badly, through unkindness, whatever. I don't know. I would like to not to go through that again, because obviously it was really unpleasant, but if I went through something like that again, I would like to think that now I would handle it very differently. I would respond very differently.
So what you're saying there effectively, Rachel, is that, life has been a great learner for you and you've learned through experience.
And it continues to be so, John. I mean, somebody commented on a post I put on LinkedIn, oh, great to see, you're still always wanting to learn. And I responded to say the day I want to stop learning will be a very sad day indeed. There's always things to learn. We don't always get it right ourselves. We see other people not getting it right. And all of that is learning experience for us.
True. This has been a very interesting conversation today, Rachel. So what I've gleaned from this conversation is, firstly, I think, get out there and enjoy life. Be prepared to go out there and visit different countries, because you learn about different nationalities, different races, different religions. You gain a new insight into life, and you broaden your experience and your outlook and experience on life. I also think that regarding children, and I'm not a parent myself, I have to say, but I think when you're bringing up children, it's more important to get the kids to think about how their actions impact other people, rather than having rule-based upbringings for children. And thirdly, it's never too late to learn and develop new skills. I'm just citing the example here of Rachel today, where she went to university at 21. She then went to Thailand, where he did distance learning courses. Always be prepared to take on new skills, develop new skills. And you have to do distance learning courses or online courses to develop a skill, so be it. Keep your options open. Don't have one course in mind and think to yourself, this course is the ultimate in A, B, or C, because you could end up disappointed. So I think this has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time today, Rachel.
I didn't particularly enjoy studying. I still don't, if I'm honest. It's not something, I know some people love constantly learning and studying and things, and it's not something that's ever brought me joy. I think, I don't have a particularly strong attention span. I'm not good at learning from reading or from watching or from listening. I'm good at learning from doing. Having said that, I was also, music, theatre, those sorts of things were always a big part of my world. I enjoyed art. I've never been very good at it. I don't have a particularly good eye, which is a shame, because my father was actually quite a good artist.